here on the East Coast of the United States. Scott Ritter joins us for his weekly time with all of you. Scott, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start right out with something that Victoria Nuland said just the other day, making or attempting to make the argument that the American forces would be justified in attacking Crimea. Now, before you react, let's listen to what she had to say.
There is a drone base in Crimea where the drones that the Iranians have given Russia are being launched from. There are command and control sites in Crimea that are essential for Russia's hold on all of the territory, including the land bridge. There are mass military installations on Crimea that Russia has turned into essential logistics and back office depots for this war. Those are legitimate targets. Ukraine is hitting them, and we are supporting that.
This is the number 2 person in the State Department of the United States. It's not Tony Blinken. It's not the secretary, obviously, purporting to justify, as I read it, an American attack on Crimea.
Well, it's a proxy American attack. What she's saying is that the United States is providing the support, both in terms of materiel, the weapons, and the intelligence, the targeting, to attack. But she's right. I mean, from a Ukrainian perspective, everything she laid out is a legitimate target. I mean, welcome to war. If Russia thinks that it can wage this conflict with Ukraine and not have these targets struck by Ukraine, that's another thing coming. But for the United States to come in and literally, a lawyer needs to review her words, Judge, because what she did.
That's the point. This is the number 2 or 3. I forget how they do the rankings. The number 2 or 3 person in the State Department of the United States with a smile from ear to ear, justifying the use of American military equipment, which we know means American military personnel, against a part of the world that has been Russia since Catherine the Great reigned over Russia, which was before George III reigned over the American colonies.
But it's not just that. Yes, we know the historical link, but she's basically saying straight up, America is a party to this conflict. Literally, she just said, we are a party to the conflict. And thank goodness the Russians aren't us. Because if there was a Russian Victoria Nuland, they'd say, well, every American base in Europe is now a target, and we are going to attack you.
That's my point. How dangerous is it for her to make a statement like this? Who knows if they ran this past the lawyers? Who knows if Tony Blinken approved it or had a heart attack when he heard about it? Whatever you think of him, he's a lot more nuanced than she is. I mean, this is reckless to the extreme, is it not?
Totally. Look, in the lead up to Desert Storm, there was an Air Force officer who spoke out about the air campaign. Nothing he said was factually wrong, but he spoke out in a way that put the Air Force in a bad light, put the United States in a bad light. He was fired the same day. Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, picked up the phone, called Colin Powell and said, fire him. And they did. Why? Because he doesn't get to make these policy decisions. She should be fired on the spot. Literally, she should be terminated, fired, kicked out. If what she's saying is American policy, okay, but that's unspoken policy. You can't commit the United States down the path that could lead inevitably to not just conflict, but nuclear conflict. She is dangerous, and she should be terminated in terms of her employment.
Could it have been a trial balloon?
Well, it's the silliest trial balloon I've ever seen, because it's a trial balloon that, to what end? It doesn't prove anything if Russia does nothing. It just means that Russia's, once again, demonstrating that they're the adult in the room. But then if Russia does something, then you're at war with Russia. It's a horrible trial balloon.
All right. As we speak, it's the end of the day in Ukraine. The sun is setting. What is your understanding is the status of control and forces in Bakhmut?
The Russians continue to push forward. The Ukrainians continue to reinforce, and people keep dying. And at some point in time, I believe the Russians are going to capture Bakhmut, whether it's through an encirclement, whether it's through just grinding their way through, they'll capture it. And when that happens, as President Zelensky has accurately said, that will burst the Ukrainian defenses, and then we'll have the Russians. Right now, if you look at Bakhmut, you got a little bit of a bubble here from this encirclement, but it's basically a line. When it bursts, the Russians are going to be able to come in and take a lot of territory. That just elongated the front lines, the line of contact. Russia has the troops to man that area. Ukraine does not, which means that this bubble is going to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. That's why Bakhmut is so important. It is literally the Gordian knot that holds Ukrainian defenses together. And when it falls, you're going to see this ballooning.
The last time we spoke, actually the last two times we spoke, Scott, you were commenting that the Ukrainians are using ammunition faster than the West can supply it, faster than the West can manufacture it. Is that still the case? Because if it is, sooner or later, the number is going to go down to zero.
No, literally, there's nothing the West can do to change this. Literally nothing. Even if Joe Biden today woke up and said, "I'm going to sign, some war powers authority for defense production," we can't get the production lines up and running. We can't get the resources allocated. We can't get things off the production line to stop what is inevitably going to happen. Ukrainians will run out of ammunition sometime this summer. And when that happens, it's all over.
What is the status of the 300,000 to 500,000 reservists, veterans, conscripts, whatever you want to call them, the people that President Putin called up around September that have been training since then? Here we now are in March. Are they on the other side of that line that you talked about, or have they begun their assault into Ukraine?
Some are on the line of contact, putting the pressure on the Ukrainians. Because remember, when Bakhmut falls, this bubble begins. In order to man that, Ukraine's going to have to pull forces away from elsewhere, which thins those line out so you get more bubbles, and you're just going to see this percolation of bubbles along the line, bursting forward, etc. That's where the Russian troops are either positioned on the line or somewhere in the rear, ready to move up and exploit these opportunities. Russia has the resources to exploit the advantageous situation that's going to evolve. Ukraine doesn't have the resources to be able to adequately man this expanding line of contact.
What is the current situation with the Wagner group? So mainstream media is saying two things. The head of Wagner and Putin are not getting along, and the Wagner troops are not getting along with their superiors. So first, give us a little bit of a picture of Wagner. Our friend, in quotes, Jack Devine, calls it a paramilitary group. I think you're going to argue it's more seriously military than paramilitary, but tell us about it. Who runs it? What's the chain of command? And is there this political tension?
Wagner was created in 2014 when this initial Ukrainian civil war happened between
when Victoria Nuland herself fomented the coup that threw out the popularly elected pro-Russian but popularly elected president of Ukraine.
Viktor Yanukovych, that's right. He fled, and the ethnic Russians were declared to be terrorists by this new neo-Nazi affiliated government. Conflict happened. Russia is prohibited by its constitution to deploy its troops outside of the Russian borders without a declaration of war or some authority given by the Russian parliament. So Wagner was created to be a vehicle through which Russia could provide military assistance. Wagner was a private military company, so any military forces sent to Wagner aren't military, they're private. It was created with a unique funding structure. Mr. Prigozhin was put in charge of this, and Wagner served its role very well. Even when the special military operation started, the Lugansk and Donetsk republics were independent, not Russia. So Wagner continued in this privileged mode, but now attacking in a more concerted fashion. They became a very valuable assault resource, and they had a high priority in terms of the provision of assistance. But when Lugansk and Donetsk became Russian territories after the annexation, after the referendums, Wagner can't exist as a private military corporation anymore legally. So Wagner became a volunteer military unit, and now it is directly reporting to the general staff, and It's part of an expanding Russian force that went from 200,000 to 700,000, which means resources are going to be thinned out. So now Wagner stopped being the only show in town with a priority of resource, and they now become one of many, still a priority, but not getting what it wanted. And so there is some tension there going on. Now, here's my problem with what's going on in the media. I don't know if you remember a while back, there was a video of a defector from Wagner, and they showed him with his head taped to a concrete block, and he confessed his sins, and then a sledgehammer hit him in the head, and because that's the Wagner symbol, the sledgehammer. And everybody said, this is how Wagner deals with traitors and all this stuff. And everybody's like, oh my God, what a horrible organization. Well, then Prigozhin came out afterwards and brought the guy out and said, no, we set this whole thing up. This was all an intelligence ploy for him to get in close, etc. Prigozhin's not a stupid man. Prigozhin knows that he owes everything to Vladimir Putin, literally everything. And then Vladimir Putin, Shoigu, Gerasimov could pull the plug on Prigozhin like that. Prigozhin would disappear. He knows this. So I believe what we're seeing here is a lot of propaganda.
Does Wagner have a chain of command in the traditional sense, which ultimately reports to someone in the Russian military?
Oh, absolutely. Wagner is a military unit, a volunteer unit that has a reporting channel through the various staffs to the general staff. Prigozhin is a civilian who handles the management of this volunteer unit in a way that, a lot of people don't understand. There's a lot of units called bars. They're volunteer units. Their management is done by the various civilian directors of the regions they come from. So if you're from the Kuban Cossacks, you have a Prigozhin type character back there also helping out. So it's not unique. I just can't believe that Prigozhin is going to sit here and do what he's doing if it weren't some sort of intelligence game to make people think there's problems with Wagner. Meanwhile, what's happening every day? Wagner's stacking the bodies. Wagner's taking the villages. Wagner's killing people. Wagner's advancing. So here on the media, it's playing out that Wagner's falling apart. There's dissension. On the battlefield, Wagner's doing its job. So I have to believe that this is sort of a game that Prigozhin's playing for intelligence purposes.
All right. So while you're on this roll, we have to run this clip of Jack Devine. It's not directly on point, but towards the end of it, he mocks Wagner.
Mm-hmm.
Take a look. Nobody knows Afghanistan the way you do, Jack, but that was the death throes of the Soviet Union. That was not Putin with a modern army.
Well, first of all, I dispute he has a modern army. He's now demonstrating to the world he doesn't have a modern army. He has a lot of modern weapons. But
he has a more modern army now than Gorbachev had in the Afghan days.
Yeah, but look at what Afghanis had, AK-47s. Look at what technology has done for the Ukrainians and all the sophisticated technology from drones to cyber intelligence. His army is not showing itself very well. It's a surprise to all of us, although this is the second time I've been surprised, because when I went in to do the Afghan program, I was assured they were 10 feet tall, and then every day they shrunk a quarter of an inch. So I think what's showing here, and I think it's the big story, he has paramilitary functioning as his cutting edge because his own army. Now they're fighting. Remember, Judge, you and I talked about dissent and how the things crumble when you start to lose. Watch the dynamic between the Wagner group and the military.
Does our dear friend, who refers to himself as the spy master from his days in the CIA, know what the hell he's talking about?
No, he doesn't. The Russian military is a very modern military with extraordinarily high levels of proficiency proven on the battlefield. You take away the propaganda, and I will tell you, if you take a U.S. Army officer who's professional, forget the propaganda stuff, and he watches how the Russians are fighting, he's going to appreciate the professionalism of the Russian soldiers, the Russian advance, the Russian utilization of artillery, etc. He may say it's not as precise as us, but he'll also say they have a heck of a lot more of it.
Right. Is this a CIA MI6 line that they want to preach to the American media? That the Russian army is not modern, is not sophisticated, is rife with dissension, and is doomed to lose? Because we've heard this from Jack before.
No, he said, look, with all due respect to Jack Devine, I'd love to debate him someday about Afghanistan. Contrary to what he believes, the Russian military wasn't defeated. They didn't leave Afghanistan with their tail between the legs like we did. They left Afghanistan because of a political decision made by Mikhail Gorbachev, as part of an overall policy called perestroika and glasnost. And they said, we're just not going to waste resources in Afghanistan. We're leaving. When they left in good order. Their general was large and in charge. Their military was not a defeated military. It wasn't the highest morale in the world. Nobody likes to leave, but they weren't defeated. In fact, Jack, I'll remind you what the reality was on the ground in 1988 for your CIA programs. You were getting beat. The Russians had adapted. The Spetsnaz were hunting down your boys and killing them like flies. The only fighter you had of any viability was Ahmed Massoud in the Panjshir Valley, and even him was pinned in there. So, Jack, the CIA wasn't as good as you think they are, and you're out there blowing smoke up people's you-know-what right now. And the Russians are pretty darn good. They're not perfect. I agree with Jack. I don't want them to be 10 foot tall, but they are about 6'2", and that's pretty big.
Which is the better fighting force, regular Russian army or Wagner group?
The regular Russian army. The regular Russian army has all the fire support, has all the support. Wagner is a purpose-built unit right now doing a very difficult job of urban warfare, but it can't do what it's doing without Russian artillery support, Russian air power, Russian electronic warfare, Russian aircraft, with Russian paratroopers and Russian mechanized infantry on their flanks protecting them. Wagner is, they're very good at what they do, but they are not a combined arms combat force.
Is President Putin still under some political pressure from his right to wage a more vigorous and quickly ending war? Is his political stability in office as sound as it was 6 months ago or a year ago?
It's stronger than it's ever been. When you say under political pressure, look, the amazing thing about Russia being a nation at war is the amount of free speech that actually takes place in their airwaves. They have people out there that are critical of the president, critical of the military. They're out there and they're not being shut down. If this was the dictatorship that everybody talks about, the plug would be pulled on all these channels. They're out there able to talk. They can't go out and demonstrate and actively, advance something that's negative to the troops, but they can. There is dissension, there's talk, but that's the element of a free society, which, newsflash to people, Russia is a freer society than, say, Ukraine or other places. But Putin's not under pressure. He doesn't feel any of this political pressure. He listens, as any leader would, but he has a strategic vision, as do his leadership, and they're moving along with that plan, and they're not going to be pushed out of the way by public opinion.
You say that Russia is a freer society than Ukraine. Was there not recently an incident in which an NBC News journalist was targeted for assassination by Ukrainian forces?
Yes, the NBC News journalist went to Crimea to do journalism, where he actually spoke to people on the ground. And as a result, because he was trying to tell the truth, provide a broader perspective, the Ukrainian intelligence services put him on what's called the Mirotvorets list. It's a kill list where people actually are targeted for assassination. Daria Dugina, a Russian journalist, the daughter of Mr. Dugin, who's a big philosopher, nationalist. You don't have to agree with him, but his daughter didn't deserve to die. She was killed, liquidated. I'm on that list. I've been on that list since June of last summer. The bottom line is, if you say anything that is deemed by the Ukrainian government not to be supportive of the narrative they're putting out, not that it's factually wrong, it's all factually correct. They just don't like the fact that I'm saying it, because by saying it, I'm apparently promoting a pro-Russian narrative, as if.
Right, Scott, I got to stop here. Are any of your friends, like the one speaking to you now, on the list?
Many are. and Judge, I think there's a spot down there for your name on it too. Unfortunately,
I better tell the New Jersey State Police that some of we shouldn't make light of this. What became of the journalist? What became of this fellow? This is a British journalist, a British citizen, a full-time employee of NBC News, writes articles based on his observations that the Ukrainian intelligence don't like. They publicly put him on the list. What became of him?
Well, he's still employed by NBC, but here's the big question. Where is NBC? Why isn't this the top story on NBC saying, get our guy off the list or we're pulling out? We're not going to do it.
Where's the State Department, which is supposed to protect the health and safety, or at least the safety of Americans in foreign countries, particularly countries with which we are allied, particularly countries that are vassal states of the United States?
Yeah, look, the State Department actually funds the what's called the Center for Countering Disinformation, which puts out a blacklist. I'm number one on the blacklist, by the way. I'm the number one anti-Ukrainian narrative producing person in the world. They have targeted me to be eliminated, silenced, removed, and it's funded by the State Department. Congress knows about this and yet continues to vote money to pay the salaries of the people who are trying to silence me for carrying out my First Amendment right of free speech.
Last Friday, a week ago today, German Chancellor Scholz visited the White House with the usual fanfare that accompanies a head of state meeting with the president. And then suddenly he and President Biden went off alone in the Oval Office. No translators. The chancellor speaks English, and apparently no aides there. We can guess at what they spoke, because suddenly there appeared on the front page, top of the fold, left-hand column of the New York Times on Monday morning. Oh, the CIA, it's hard for me to say this with a straight face, Scott, found a sailboat. A sailboat that was in the Baltic Sea about the same time that the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, and they're investigating who on the sailboat might have been involved with blowing up the pipeline. My guess, the chancellor said, Joe, you're killing me. You blew this up without telling us. I'm going to be thrown out of office if you don't come up with some kind of an explanation to counter this guy, Cy Hirsch, because most of my people believe Cy.
Apparently, we have to prepare for war with China in 3 years' time, so we should order our military fatigues now and get into a bit of practice. And this was the assertion from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, both owned by Nine Media, and followed up with a bit more blustering from News Corporation. And it's part of Nine Media's Red Alert series. And Red Alert is a 5-person panel comprising former senior Defence Department official Peter Jennings, university lecturer in strategic studies and criminology Lavina Lee, former Federal Chief Scientist Alan Finkel, the chair of the National Institute of Strategic Resilience Leslie Seebeck, and retired Army Major General Mick Ryan. It's got no official capacity, it's just a collection of former officials. They're all white Anglo people. There's no one on this panel from a Chinese background, and I don't think any of these people are notable experts on the politics of China. But if you do want to read some tabloid sensationalist garbage, well, this is the place to go to. The topic of the conversation is Australia prepared for war with China? And what does that even mean? Australia will never be prepared for a war with China. And the other thing is, well, why are we even talking about a war with China? And some of these people are hawks on the idea of war with China. Peter Jennings from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute definitely is. And one of the journalists who wrote up the story, Peter Harcher, he's consistently had an unhinged anti-China perspective in most of his articles. And David, we've been critics of the media for its conservative biases in the past. That's what we commonly talk about each week. But this would have to be some of the most irresponsible journalism that you could ever come across.
China and Australia have had traditionally good relationship since about 72, when Gough Whitlam officially recognised China as a state. Now, Malcolm Fraser and John Howard, and of course Howard's 20 years later, but Malcolm Fraser and John Howard never rescinded this recognition. Now, John Howard had problems with the Chinese community that were of his own making. But in terms of the relationship with China, China's our biggest trade partner. And we have, of course, many people of Chinese heritage in Australia. But it's funny how the media distorts this stuff. There are people of Chinese descent who have been in Australia since the 1850s, which is, I'm going to bet, a lot longer than 3 or 4 of that panel of hawks. Now, the other thing we have to remember is William Randolph Hearst, the American media mogul, said that war was good for his business. And so he stirred up war. And this has been a part of media strategy to get influence. You stir up conflict and war because people buy papers to see what's going on. It's a new media market. People aren't buying papers, and they don't go to the newspapers for their first line of inquiry anymore. They've basically lost the under 35s. I think it's less than 1 in 20 under 35 buy newspapers with any regularity. Of course, what they want is the influence. They can handle the loss of sales, but politicians looking at the headlines and saying, oh no, what will people think of me? Oh no, people want war with China. I don't think anybody wants war with China. And I reckon the first people to be sent to China with weapons to actually get some shots fired at them in anger is those 5. Maybe the general could handle it, but I'm pretty sure the others couldn't.
And of course, there are tensions between China and the United States, as there were between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War period. And that's been the nature of big power geopolitics pretty much forever. And there always has to be a threat from a big country that can be portrayed as the other, and that fulfills the needs of the military industry, not just in the United States, but all around the world. And for all of the time of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was never one act of war between them, although you could argue that it got very close during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, but superpowers never go to war against each other. So that's one issue. And there were also tensions between China and Australia during the time of the coalition government, maybe after 2015 or thereabouts afterwards, and Australia is slowly patching up that relationship with China. Now, I'm not trying to be all Pollyanna-ish about this and claim that everything's fine. There are problems with the Chinese government, and the relationship between China and Australia has got issues as well. But I don't think that going to war with China is one of these problems. And the Sydney Morning Herald and Nine Media doesn't actually explain how a war in 3 years' time with China is going to happen, or what is going to precede this, or what the circumstances are. It's just sensationalist clickbait material, and it's all pretty much according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's propaganda and propping up a defence industry that wants to boost sales. And if we have a look at the links within the Liberal Party, and just wanted to point out that former Labor MPs have also got links with the defence industry too, but the former Liberal Party Minister Christopher Pyne, he's on the board of NIOA, and that's an Australian military manufacturer based in Queensland. He's also on the board of the Australian Missile Corporation. And there's also the former Liberal Party Treasurer, Peter Costello. He's on the chair of Nine Media. So there's a lot that needs to be looked at here. Pushing that argument that Australia is not prepared for war with China, well, look who actually benefits from all of this. And essentially, we've got a mainstream media outlet with political connections that's doing the bidding of the military industry in Australia. It's absolutely outrageous.
The outrage is palpable. Lives are at risk, even if it's a few skirmishes. You never hear of a skirmish where neither side had casualties. And America is declining as a great power. China is expanding as a great power. So there's going to be those tensions. But neither side, I think, wants to commit too much to war. America doesn't want to risk losing another war. China doesn't want to risk being weakened at a crucial part of its growth. Australia doesn't really figure into this type of thinking, by the way, I don't think. I think if you were to ask Chinese military, they'd say, yes, Australia might take us 3 days, 4 if the wind's the wrong way and we have to recalibrate some of our cannons. Even suggested as a semi-serious thing is insane, and it shows just how desperate the mainstream media is in Australia to remain relevant.
And the former Prime Minister Paul Keating, he's also joined the conversation, and he's accused these media outlets of producing the most egregious and provocative news presentations in over 5 decades, and that's probably correct. But while we might be all getting up in arms about this, I don't think this will really have a great effect or great influence. I'd say that the Beijing leadership is probably having a good chuckle about this. The two-way trade between China and Australia is worth $235 billion each year. That's $153 billion in exports for Australia, and imports from China valued at around $82 billion per year. So these are big figures, and neither country would want to harm that economic relationship. So generally, this type of reporting probably isn't going to cause any kind of war or have any effect in Beijing, but it just continues with all of those racist tropes. Red alert, that's almost like the Reds under the bed commentary, or all of that yellow peril from Menzies' time and before, and it just feeds into that racist undercurrent in Australia that the media has had so many opportunities to shed, but it just wants to keep hanging on to that just for the sake of a few newspaper sales and keeping its right-wing advertisers happy. And as you mentioned before, keeping its influence as well. And it seems that Australia is more concerned about war than anyone else in the world. And as far as I'm concerned, a war with Australia wouldn't even be on China's radar. Australia is actually more concerned about war in Taiwan than even the Taiwanese are. And Taiwan's actually on the doorstep of mainland China. And all of this just promotes that idea of Australia being a small, insecure country that will never grow up and is still fearful of its own shadows. And it also puts pressure on the Chinese communities in Australia. They're the ones who usually bear the brunt of these media paranoias and racist undertones.